So one of the big stories that we looked at this week earlier on was the ludicrous nature of what went on during those COVID years that some of us would rather forget, that some of us would rather not remember, and that some people don't even want to think about because it was so weird. But one of the organisations that's been so good at making sure that we don't forget, because we shouldn't ever forget what happened and what the government put us through, is Us for Them. We've got Molly Kingsley right now with us. Molly, very good morning to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mike.
You had quite a week, didn't you? Us for Them came out with this incredible investigation which proved that not only were we being misled and led down the garden path by an awful lot of these SAGE health advisors, and SAGE, of course, was the organisation that was kind of advising the government on what should happen vis-a-vis mask wearing and social distancing and school closures and all the rest of it. And it turns out that many of the leading lights of that time, like Professor Neil Ferguson and Susan Michie, and the people who were telling us exactly what we should be doing, it turns out they were all in receipt of massive amounts of money from a big pharmaceutical company.
Yeah, I mean, these are leading professors on SAGE. So you're right, SAGE was the body of experts who were really responsible for, I would say, setting government policy. They would dispute that. They would say we were just advisors. But they had clearly an enormous role in swaying government pandemic policy. So, if they advised that we needed to be locked down, needed to be wearing masks, needed to be wearing social distancing, a few weeks later, we would find we were doing all of those things. And obviously, it is quite key, many of us would think, that these experts, and SAGE, it's important, I think, to stress, is held out as an independent advisory body. And I think the public has a right to expect that those kind of experts in these really pivotal roles are independent.
Yeah.
And as you say, it turns out many of them were in receipt of, and it's not quite as direct as saying they were in receipt of money from the pharmaceutical industry or pharmaceutical companies.
Right.
Some of them may have been, but that's not what our report was about. But what our report disclosed was that many of them, and actually about a quarter of the entire membership of SAGE, so it was, I think, 38 members in total, had taken grant money from the Wellcome Trust. And as many of your listeners will know, Wellcome is, it's got lots of fingers in lots of pies, but it's certainly got a very big finger in the pharmaceutical industry. So it is a very big...
And it's got an awful lot of money to throw around as well, right?
Yes, it is an incredibly well-endowed investment charity. I think it might even be the biggest in the UK, actually, but it has got, funds of billions and billions of pounds, much of which, or a significant portion of which, is directly invested in the pharmaceutical industry. And it is an enormous sponsor of pharmaceutical research. Now, nothing wrong with that. Obviously companies are allowed to invest in what they want to, charities are allowed to do what they do. And I'm sure a lot of its work will be very, very good. But it is undeniable that it had a very particular outlook when it came to management of viruses, and in particular the pandemic. So actually it was the Wellcome Trust that started, do you remember the whole zero COVID initiative?
Yeah.
So, until there is zero COVID, we will all be locked down and wearing masks. Well, that initiative was actually seeded originally by the Wellcome Trust. So I think a lot of people would be very concerned to learn that the same scientists who were taking money for grant research from Wellcome had this very instrumental role in advising government on key areas of pandemic policy.
Professor Neil Ferguson. Neil Ferguson, of course, famously was the guy who many, many years before COVID had recommended burning all those cows, hadn't he, during the foot and mouth problem. And there were piles and piles of carcasses of burning cattle up and down the country because he said that it was a really terrible situation and many, many more animals were going to die, which, of course, he got that massively wrong as well. But according to your report here, he declared in the register that he was involved with a vaccine impact modelling consortium, but he didn't mention the fact that it was being sponsored by Wellcome.
No, I know. And actually, Ferguson's an interesting one because Imperial College where he was a professor, had taken millions, and I saw a figure. I think it was over $100 million they had taken from the Gates Foundation, which is another one of these very big pharmaceutical industry investors, and it had taken that enormous sum of money in the 3 years preceding the pandemic to develop vaccine projects. So, the whole thing. There's just these enormous sums of money floating
Yeah.
around the ecosystem, and it's about visibility and transparency, isn't it? If people are acting as public health officials, then clearly any private interests that they have or that might or might not influence their decisions need to be made available for scrutiny.
And let's talk a bit about Susan Michie as well, because she was on the TV a lot, and she was very hardline about everything. I mean, she was the woman who was a former member of the Communist Party, who appears to have been in receipt of quite a lot of money as well from these welcome grants. But she was the one who said that even once COVID was finished and done with, that we should keep social distancing as a way of life, and we should keep wearing masks when we were going out in public. She was really quite dangerous.
Yeah, she was. If memory serves me right, she was one of the key advocates of the zero COVID
Yes.
outlook, which was extreme, and it was particularly extreme as it applied to children, because as I said at the time, and as Mike, I know you and I had many conversations about at the time, you can't have a zero COVID philosophy and a happy functioning childhood. It
Right.
doesn't work.
Right.
What do you do? You mask your children, you keep them in the house, you stop them having friends. Like, it's pretty
You
grotesque.
start warning them that they might kill their grandparents.
You do, and we're seeing the consequences of that now, and so many children now have mental health issues, and I think it's wrong to attribute all of that to the pandemic. But I don't think there'll be many people who disagree with the idea that the pandemic really didn't help children. And she was one of the biggest proponents of that. She was very extreme. And actually, her grant was interesting. I mean, we only see what's available on the Wellcome database. That's the only reason we actually know about these undeclared grants. But if you look at what her grant is, it looked directly relevant. Her grant was for a behavioural science research project.
Right.
Now, we don't know whether that was related to the pandemic, but it certainly sounds very similar to the kind of thing that she was heavily involved and invested in during the pandemic.
Yeah, there was really no discussion, was there? And we all remember, and I said at the start, a lot of people kind of want to forget those years, and they want to forget what it was like. But actually, we must never forget what it was like, particularly, as you say, with this new digital ID idea, where again, they're obviously going to be trying to push people into doing something that they might not want to do.
No, exactly. And I mean, I think that, of the digital ID, in a way, it's different, but actually in some ways it's even scarier, because it will be a way of combining all these, all your behaviors potentially are trackable through digital ID. And you talked about being nudged to do things, so you can well see a system where we are either nudged towards certain behaviors, whether that's medical stuff, it may be, or whether it's more mundane stuff. Take your recycling out, don't drive your car, use your bike.
Right.
Or is your kid in school, has your children missed school?
Yeah.
All that kind of thing could potentially be brought within the scope of digital ID. And I don't think that's an outlandish position, and in fact, Keir Starmer has explicitly talked about some of those things being within digital ID. And you just think, and particularly if you combine the different trends, so you have this platform that allows for the surveillance and the monitoring of behavior. You have these government committees who, at the best of times, were quite shady, and we now know are subject to external influence, kind of guiding government policy. And I think we should be really, really, really uneasy about that.
Yeah, let's just talk a little bit about the fraud, because a story came out this week that £10.9 billion of taxpayers' money, which is probably the tip of the iceberg, was basically fraudulently removed from government coffers by people in taking out bounce back loans, by people setting up PPE companies, and we know all about Michelle Mone and all of that. And I mean, some ludicrous things that happened. And again, at the time, we were saying it. We were being branded as kind of rebellious, terrible, ghastly people. We have to do it this way because it's an emergency. Well, you don't actually. It was never something that they had to do. They just literally threw money at people. And we know stories of people that set up a company literally the day before they applied for a bounce back loan, took the bounce back loan, and then shut the company. You don't have to be particularly clever to see that that would happen.
No, you don't. And it was such an ill thought out policy. And it's, yeah, I mean, they divorced the moral hazard of these policies from, the people responsible for paying, which was us, the taxpayer, were not the people setting the policy. And it's very easy to give other people's money away. And I think that's what we saw time and time again. And I think, unfortunately, this 10.9 billion figure, which is shocking in itself, but it's clearly significantly lower than the actual figure of COVID. I mean, not only fraud, but just waste. I mean, was it test and trace that was that 33, 34 billion in itself?
Right.
I mean, and I, again, where, you talked about not letting that period go. And I think there's quite a lot of us actually in the bucket of, I feel I will never let this period go.
Right.
And that's in part because actually of just the huge economic shadow it's going to cast over the rest of our lives and probably our children's lives.
Yeah.
I mean, it's billions of pounds of debt that have been added to the public purse. I mean, our children are going to be paying this off the rest of their lifetimes.
Yeah.
And I think it'll be very interesting. So this glacial COVID inquiry, which incidentally did not pick up any of the things we've just talked about the SAGE committee, hasn't picked up about, really significant findings on this ethics committee. But it's on track to spend over £200 million. So, it's
and they haven't
bad money after bad.
Yeah, and I think I'm right in saying they haven't really looked into what the situation was with children and schools. They weren't really ever going to look at that in any great detail. And just to go back to the fraud, something like £13.6 billion was spent on PPE procurement, 38 billion items purchased, 11 billion were unused by 2024. Losses were estimated at 10 billion from over ordering, and they think about 324 million was fraud. And you just think this is insane.